So this first little nutrition lecture is an overview on really what we should be eating. It's not speaking specifically to the type of foods we should eat before, during, and after working out. That's another lecture I can give again this year in a couple weeks, hopefully. We can set that up. I welcome you to think of other topics throughout this lecture that are of interest to you, and I can prepare another lecture or talk to you one-on-one about those subjects too. So again, this is just like an overview on what we should be eating, because there's a lot of myths out there and the media is by no means a good source of information. However, it's most people's main source of nutrition advice. So I will be referencing this graphic a lot because it is, in my opinion, the best graphic to communicate to people how we should be eating. You might be familiar with the food pyramid. That has been gone for about maybe 10 years now because it was confusing and didn't work. So USDA came out with something called MyPlate. You might be familiar with it, you might have heard it. If you have any children in school, they've probably seen it more than you've ever seen it. However, the USDA was heavily influenced by industry groups who paid to get their food represented more. So the point is, we use, in the nutrition world, when you're not being paid by the government, we really recommend people look at this graphic made by Harvard School of Public Health, which is a riff on the MyPlate, and it's called the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate. So I will go through, explain a little bit of this in more detail, but this graphic is also available on their website, and I'll show you that at the end of the presentation today, so that you can go and look for a lot more information on any questions you might have regarding what you should be eating on a daily basis. So if you see here, half of the plate is dedicated to fruits and vegetables. And just another note, this graphic is for adults. So basically anyone over 18, this is what your daily intake should look like. So if you put all of your food in one plate throughout the day, this is like the relative ratios of what you would be consuming throughout the whole day. So if you notice, half of the plate on the left-hand side is all produce, basically, fruits and vegetables. This is not how most people eat. However, this is exactly what the research shows us we should be doing. You notice that a fourth of the plate is whole grains. So these are starchy carbs. And a fourth of the plate is healthy protein sources. Okay, and there's more information here, but we'll get to that. And the way you should be looking at what you're eating is more on a macro view than a micro view. So, I keep predominantly plant-based, but yesterday I did have a scoop of ice cream, and that's okay. Some people get really bent out of shape about individual choices, and the research shows us that looking at your food choices on a, individual selection basis, you lose the big idea of what you're ultimately trying to do. And what you're trying to do is have a dietary pattern that really serves you long term. So we care more about the pattern of your consumption than any singular day. So give yourself a break if you have a bad day or a bad meal, what is not nutritious, and just look at your pattern of eating instead. So if you have, 3 cans of soda every day, that's part of your pattern, right? That's a bad choice. But if it's a rare option for you to select something like soda, which we all know is not a healthy choice, then don't beat yourself up. It's fine. It's not part of your dietary pattern, right? So the research shows us that if 90% of your choices are health promoting, then you have 10% of your food can be pretty flexible. And if you think about your meals throughout the week, that gives you quite a bit of flexibility, like a decent amount of flexibility. This idea of like a cheat day, while the whole day might be too much, a couple meals throughout the week can be kind of garbage meals, if you will. Okay, that's just a frame of reference overview of how we approach our diet. So especially as athletes, but for all humans, carbohydrates are the main source of energy for our bodies. So anyone that's afraid of carbohydrates, A, needs to be more educated because it's extremely difficult to not eat carbohydrates. They're not just like bread and candy. They span a lot more than that. But our bodies need carbohydrates to survive. Carbs are king. If we can ingrain that in our minds, we'll have a friendlier approach to carbohydrates. The key here is that they are complex carbohydrates instead of simple carbohydrates. Complex carbohydrates are whole foods as opposed to processed refined foods. I'll get into that a little bit more. Simple carbohydrates are lacking fiber and they've been stripped from their natural state to for whatever reason. It makes them energy dense, so super caloric. And also, if you've noticed, makes them kind of addicting, right? There's a reason people can eat a whole bag of cookies, but they cannot eat a whole bag of carrots. Like they're hyperpalatable, excuse me, that is the term that they use in the nutrition world for simple carbs. These all lack fiber. Even the regular pasta will lack fiber. It's not as nutritious as like a whole grain pasta, okay? On the right, you can see pictures of complex carbohydrates. These obviously are plant-based. This bread here is supposed to show like a whole grain bread. Bread is not the enemy. You just want to make sure that it has as much fiber as you can get. So this is a lot of detail, maybe more than some people want to know, but simple carbohydrates are refined. Like I said before, these are like simple sugars. They really bump up your blood sugar and they can give you a quick hit. So if you're like crashing mentally, and it's okay to have a simple carbohydrate like some OJ or a little piece of candy or apple juice. It'll perk you up pretty quickly, but these are not things that will sustain your energy. So complex carbohydrates contain the fiber. That's why they will be absorbed into your body more slowly, and you won't get a rush of sugar. Instead, you'll have like a slower absorption, a more sustained energy source from the food that you chose. And because they contain fiber, they make you feel fuller. And then there's like 1,000 more nutrients that a whole food would have versus the refined version of it. For instance, the entire orange, not the peel, but the orange itself, has hundreds and hundreds of nutrients that you don't ever hear about unless you're actually reading studies, which no one does, right? As opposed to just orange juice is really stripping away some of those other nutrients. So when possible, aim for the whole food option. Here are some more pictures. Complex carbohydrates, right? Whole foods, oatmeal. This is supposed to be darker pasta, whole grain pasta, versus these hyperpalatable simple carbohydrates. Okay, again, choosing things with fiber is really ideal. Most Americans don't consume nearly enough fiber. Fiber is the primary fuel for your gut health, I'll have you know. Our gut lining is really sensitive. Our gut has only a single cell lining. You can totally change the gut flora, so the types of bacteria in your gut, just within 3 days of eating healthy. But that also means within 3 days of eating poorly, you can totally wreck your gut. So it takes a couple days to get it back where it should be. So again, the type of carbohydrate matters more than the amount. I didn't say that yet actually, but so don't get hung up too much on like eating way too much brown rice. If it's really health promoting, it's okay to consume more of it. Okay, so moving on to proteins. Healthier sources of proteins are going to be, in terms of animal proteins, will be fish and chicken. And then plant-based proteins like beans and nuts. Some people tell me that they don't ever eat beans, and that really doesn't shock me, I guess, but I definitely try to encourage people to consider consuming more beans, whether that's through bean dips or, like lentil soups. Beans are remarkably nutritious, extremely nutritious, and should be a part of everyone's dietary pattern. Lower quality proteins are going to be red meat and processed meats. These are extremely inflammatory in multiple ways. They have inflammatory compounds just to begin with, and then when you cook them, more stuff happens in the body, especially for athletes where we're incurring like more inflammation in general because of the hard workouts. You really want to avoid red meats and processed meats. Be careful of dairy. dairy is pretty high in saturated fat. So if you do choose dairy, look for sure unsweetened dairy. So if you think you're having a healthy choice by eating like strawberry yogurt every morning, look at that nutrition panel and look at the grams of sugar. It's a poor choice for breakfast, but if you have like an ice cream addiction, a better choice might be having like a sweetened yogurt, and then you can like, you know, it's all relative, right? So if you can wean yourself off of high fat ice cream with a sweetened yogurt, and then eventually maybe get down to like an unsweetened yogurt where you add your own fruit, it's an even better progression. Dairy itself is not that. If you do consume dairy, make sure it's in smaller amounts because of the really high load of saturated fat. If you're someone that has high cholesterol, you really want to make sure you limit your egg and animal meat consumption. I forget the number, but it's somewhere around, we think 20% of people are super sensitive to dietary cholesterol. We don't need to consume any cholesterol. Our body makes everything we need. Some people, their cholesterol is totally linked to their dietary intake. So if it happens to be you or someone you know, educate them. And if they cut out these foods, it's likely that they will decrease their high cholesterol. But it's only like 20% of people. So it also may have no impact. You don't know. It's worth trying. Athletes get caught up on protein. A big reminder to everyone that protein bars and drinks are truly inferior to whole food choices. Whole food protein options have tons of nutrients, minerals, micronutrients, phytochemicals, anti-inflammatory compounds. Protein bars and drinks, generally, they are just made from extracting just the protein from, you know, pea protein or milk. They might have like really like 10 nutrients in them versus like a whole food option, which would have hundreds of nutrients. So you might get swayed by some of the marketing of these protein bars or shakes by what they've included in their ingredients. But what you want to look for to really discern if it's a quality protein option is if they're using whole food nutrition. There are some out there that use like oats. They literally put oats into the product. They don't extrapolate something from the oats in order to use just that singular ingredient. So again, look for the whole food nutrition. However, there is a time to consume stuff like meal replacement protein shakes, and that would be, say, when you just like do not have time for whatever reason to consume a meal, or you're going a long stretch of time, you know, say you're on a road trip and you just refuse to stop, like that's a time where consuming something like that is worthwhile. But as part of your dietary pattern, you should not be really relying on those things. And then just in summary, plant-based proteins have beneficial fiber. So examples of the plant-based protein options are beans, grains, nuts, and seeds. There is protein actually in vegetables, but it's pretty low, so it's not worth counting. Here's the graphic of healthier protein options. And again, vegetables do contain some. So people who eat a ton of vegetables, it does contribute to their protein intake throughout the day because of the volume of vegetables that they consume. Okay, how much protein? Well, remember back to the My Plate picture, about a quarter of the plate should be protein. Protein's confusing because it's not like a food, it's one component of food, right? So the recommendations for protein for adults are like 0.8 gram per kilogram of body weight per day. What does that mean? We don't weigh ourselves in kilograms, but if you were to take your pounds, convert it into kilograms, and then multiply by 0.8, what that ultimately gets down to as a factor is about 1/3. So if you take your pounds of weight and divide it by 1/3, that is approximately, it's pretty close, the amount of grams that are recommended for your body weight. If you're overweight and significantly and you're trying to reduce that, then you wouldn't really want to be eating to sustain that higher weight. So if your weight is pretty healthy, even if it's a little heavier than you want it to be, you're still probably going to be eating for that weight. So for instance, a 150-pound person, 1/3 of that is roughly 50 grams of protein daily. When you start eating like protein shakes daily, you really ramp up your protein intake, and that is no bueno. High protein diets are not healthy for adults and for endurance athletes especially. Protein's really hard on your system. So unless you're actively trying to consume a large amount of protein, or you have lots of red meat or animal meat in every meal, it's unlikely you're consuming a ton of protein. If you're someone who thinks that your meal has to have like animal meat in it, it's likely that you're consuming far too much protein. I would encourage you to try to bring it down. Every meal does not have to have like an animal meat protein source, definitely not, or even a sea animal protein source. Again, high protein diets are bad for endurance athletes. They're very heavy on the system to digest. They're inflammatory, and what it does is it crowds out all the healthier food options that you really should be eating. There's this idea that athletes need more protein, and I want to address this myth because it's misleading. Athletes need more protein, yes, but they also need more carbohydrates. They need more fat. They need more water. So this concept of athletes needing more protein is taken out of context, and people think that they just need to add in like a protein shake. So basically eat your normal food, and then the times that you work out more, you just like need to add only more protein. It's not true at all. You need more of everything. So you need more calories, you need more of everything. So it's pretty simple that if you're just like working out more, say in the summer, I tend to work out a lot more. I need to be consuming, in order to support those physical demands on my body, I need to be consuming just more food in general. So an extra serving of my meals, more, healthy snacks between. Some people can get caught up on the amount of protein, but the source, again, matters more than the amount, just like we said for carbohydrates. So we need to expand our thinking from like counting what we're consuming and think more so along the lines of like relative amounts that we're consuming throughout the day. That's where the MyPlate can be helpful. So a lot more produce than protein, and protein and starches are about even. There's more nuance to that, but I will leave it at superficial level for now. On to fats. So high fat diets are also not recommended for athletes. These were trendy not too long ago, but again, what it does is it crowds out a lot of the healthier food that we need to eat to thrive and to combat the inflammation in our modern lives, and especially as athletes. Eating healthy foods can also combat like environmental stress, or if you are around like a lot of urban pollution, if you eat a lot of red meat. Actually, there was a study that showed that the inflammatory effects of red meat can be somewhat mitigated if in the same meal you are consuming a high fiber, super nutritious vegetable source. It was like broccoli in the study. So fun fact, if you do have this love of red meat, which we know is not as healthy as like fish or chicken, I encourage you to pair it with something that you know will help mitigate the negative effects of that red meat on the system. The type of fat matters a lot. And what we really want to look for are the unsaturated fats. This gets a little sciencey, but hopefully you'll then know how to read labels and select the right option. Typical fat sources in the diet, as you can see here, are oils, nuts, seeds, fish, animal products, animal fats. Unsaturated fats include monounsaturated fat and polyunsaturated fat. These fats are beneficial to your health. They are health promoting. Saturated fats are definitely not health promoting. Saturated fats make your blood supply, make your like blood vessels. Basically, saturated fats can lead to more atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, which can lead to cardiovascular disease, which is like a number one killer, right? So really, really minimize the saturated fats. You can see examples here. So saturated fats, an easy way to remember the difference here is that saturated fats are solid at room temperature and unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature. Now, when you get into whole food nutrition, it's hard to tell what an avocado is or what nuts and seeds are because they're obviously packaged not in an extracted oil form. But you should know that things like olive oil, it's not nearly as bad for you as a saturated fat like palm oil or butter. It's still not exactly like a health food. So don't think you need to add olive oil to things to be healthy. It's more like the healthier option among the fat options. So if eating a dressing with olive oil helps you eat your leafy greens, then go for it. But if you're like, I need to get my olive oil in because it's healthy, so I'm going to have some more bread dipped in olive oil, that's not really a healthy choice. That's just like maybe a feel-good choice. Hopefully that makes sense. Nuts, seeds, fish, avocado, olives. If anyone here eats an entirely plant-based diet, they need to be, or if anyone here does not eat fish, they need to be a little more cognizant of where they're getting their omega-3s from. Fish oils are an excellent source of omega-3s, and really what's better than fish oil is a microalgae source, which you can buy at Whole Foods and online. Fish, krill, do not make omega-3s. They eat algae and then store the omega-3s, and then we kill all these fish and we're ruining the balance in the ecosystem because of the massive harvesting of krill for omega-3 fatty acid oil. And instead, what we could just be doing is all buying the microalgae supplement instead. Being in Chicago, fish is not a huge staple, right? Because we're not like a coastal city. Be careful of low-fat advertising. Usually what that means is they took out the fat and added sugar, okay? So again, if you're gonna have a yogurt or a dairy, buy the normal fat amount or the low fat amount, but just make sure that it doesn't mean that they added in sugar instead. Low fat milk, low fat yogurt, still good options. Just make sure it's not super sweetened because they took out the fat. Okay. In summary, choose the good unsaturated fats. The examples I wrote down here. Limit the saturated fats. That includes coconut oil and palm oil. Think of coconut oil as more of like a neutral element. It's a saturated fat because it's solid at room temperature, right? The studies show that like it does not act like a normal saturated fat because normal saturated fats are bad for you. They're really inflammatory. They have all these other effects on atherosclerosis. Coconut oil doesn't really do that. So if you're going to use coconut oil to like swap out butter, good idea. If you're going to use coconut oil to like roast your vegetables in, bad idea. Trans fats are totally the devil. They should be pretty much gone from the food supply, but they're still sneakily like in some foods like nut butters. A lot of shelf stable baked goods can still have partially hydrogenated oils. So check labels, but by and large, it shouldn't be much of a problem to have trans fats. A picture of healthy fats. Looks like it's mostly just olives and oil. When I keep saying this repetitive phrase about the type of the food, the type of the category, so carbohydrates, protein, fat matters more than the amount. This idea of high fat or low fat diets is distracting from what we really should be focusing on, which is the type of fat that we're consuming. So the quality of the food matters more so than the amount. Okay, so in summary, some takeaways on what we should be eating in general to be a health promoting diet. And diet can have a bad connotation, right? But what it means is our dietary pattern, our way of eating. So most people are really deficient in fiber and vegetables, and it leads to so much more chronic health problems than if they were just to be regularly consuming more produce and more plants in general. So fruits, vegetables, beans, and grains. These should be staples in everyone's diet, not just people who eat totally plant-based, in everyone's diet. 2, reduce animal protein. What that means, what's that speaking to, is that most Americans consume far too much animal proteins. Animal proteins are not totally bad. We just have way too large of a dependence. That's not totally our fault. We've kind of been brainwashed by the cattle industry mostly to consume animal meat, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and even jerky for snacks. Okay. Number 3, reduce processed food. What that's speaking to is the simple carbohydrates. They are devoid of nutrition. Really aim to get your food from complex carbohydrates, whole food nutrition. Even if it is processed, just make sure it's like whole food nutrition. Look at the ingredient deck, try to get familiar. The more you start looking at those things, the ingredient panels, the nutrition panel and the ingredient deck, the less foreign it will seem. And you're welcome to ask me questions on those two things. They're not easy for the average person to read, so have no shame in not understanding them. Choose unhealthy unsaturated fats. We just reviewed that. Again, those are monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. And you can see that if you're ever confused, that's the perfect place to look at the nutrition facts panel on a food item. And fats are not the enemy either. So super, super low fat diets, like less than 10% of your intake, are dangerous. Again, this is what the plate looks like. I'm not sure why I included it so many times, but I want to point everyone to what the website looks like so that you can feel empowered to go look up more information on your own. This is, if you were to type in Harvard Healthy Eating Plate, you will see this homepage, and you can, on the left-hand side, go through a lot more information. And this website is really aimed to the general public. So think of Harvard's public health website as, what they did basically was they made it a public service. Our national guidelines for nutrition should look more like this website. It's user-friendly. The way they wrote about the nutrition recommendations, so it's not super complex, which nutrition can get very easily hard to understand. They also have a kids healthy eating plate, which is very helpful. If anyone has children who are like younger than 18 or probably younger than that, and someone who is not on the call, she asked a question about food combining. There's this concept that plant-based proteins are incomplete. That's a myth. And therefore, you need to be eating complementary foods in order to consume all the essential amino acids for your body to then make proteins. Proteins are made up of amino acids. There's this thing called essential amino acids, meaning ones that we don't produce internally. We have to consume from our diet. However, this was debunked decades ago, and unfortunately the media still to this day perpetuates this old concept from the 70s, and it's just total bogus. So you should know a couple things. You don't have to worry about food combining. All protein sources contain all amino acids, just in different levels. And the body has a storage, like these pools of amino acids that they store, essentially, especially lysine, which can be low in a plant-based diet, but the body stores it, so it's not a problem. This has been studied for decades, and it's never actually panned out. There's never been someone that's protein deficient who eats plant-based, and our body recycles protein. So everything in your body is really made up of the building blocks of it. So, your bones and, a lot of things in a cell are hormones. Everything is really made up of proteins, and we're constantly breaking those things down internally and repairing. The body will recycle a lot of the proteins that are already in the body. I'm not sure if that was confusing, but put it this way. We have a lot of proteins that get broken down in the body, and then we have proteins that we consume. And they think that roughly the average person, their body recycles about the same amount as what they're consuming, if you're consuming the correct amount. So basically, you have double in your GI tract the amount of proteins that you really need. And what I'm trying to speak to is that there's this idea that we really need to be hyper-focused on getting enough protein. And it's just not true, because our body is really good at maintaining protein levels via recycling and storing of amino acids for when they're needed.